Welcome to episode 30 of the Arizona Originals Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Isaac. This podcast is brought to you by the Arizona Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and here we share with you the stories of the people who make Arizona a great place to live and to work. Before we begin, a couple quick requests. Whatever app you use to listen to Arizona Originals, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or iHeartRadio, please subscribe and leave a rating. When you do those two simple things, it helps us get the word out about this podcast and ultimately about the amazing people that you hear on the show. Also, be sure to check out the podcast website at azoriginals.net or check out the show notes on whatever podcast app you use, because there we have the links to the things our guests mention on the shows. If you go to the website, it has links from our very first episode forward, and I've recently begun making the notes more robust in the apps, so you can find many of the links right there. So now, let's get on to today's guest. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is a local internist, former Navy physician who served as one of the attending physicians for the U.S. Congress, and the founder of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. His parents were political refugees from Syria who immigrated to the U.S. Dr. Jasser grew up in Wisconsin and discusses how his passion for political change, social change, and cultural change developed from the time he was a young boy. He shares some fascinating insights on passion, balance, and how to make sure your competitive drive does not lead down a destructive path. And be sure to listen to the very end, after the lightning round, where I squeeze in one more question about having a sense of humor, and I think you'll find that fascinating. So, without any further delay, let's get on to our conversation. Zuhdi Jasser, thanks so much for being with us today.
It's great to be with you. It's an honor to participate in your conversations.
Why don't we start off? Tell me a little bit about your background and where you grew up. Then we'll take a step back and talk about your grandfather and your parents and their background before they came to the U.S. But tell us a little bit about your experience growing up.
Yeah, so when my family came here from Syria, they ultimately settled in Neenah, Wisconsin, a little south of Green Bay. I grew up there from the age of 4 until I graduated from medical school in Milwaukee. So a small town in Neenah, Wisconsin. Went to grade school in Appleton and then high school in Neenah, at Neenah High School. I remember my parents built the first mosque in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin, in Neenah, Menasha.
The first ever.
Yeah, the first ever. It was in 1978, and it took a year or so to get permission. There were some protests at the time because there was the hostage crisis. And, a lot of the Muslim community thinks that this is the first time we've had pressure. And, sometimes any immigrant community, if you look, has had some pressures in some xenophobia that exists. But I will tell you that as much as there might have been a few hundred that showed up to protest our mosque, our little, small little mosque in northern Wisconsin, there were tens of thousands that supported it. We were doing prayers at the Xavier Church, the Catholic church down the street, for years. The priest there was my father's patient. And the synagogue also in town supported our community. So there was a lot of interfaith support, but naturally into the 200, 300, 400 days of a hostage crisis that was happening at the time, there were some folks that were concerned about a mosque being built in Wisconsin. And I remember at the time, some of the mosques in America are foreign funded. Our mosque was built by 4 families. Mine was one of them. My parents helped build a little small, it didn't even look like a mosque. It looked like a little 2-bedroom house. And I was just back in Wisconsin last fall, and we went and visited the community. It's now 600-700 people. They've added on to that building, but it still looks pretty similar to the mosque we built in '79.
Wow. Brothers and sisters?
I have 2 younger sisters. They are 6 years and 12 years younger than me. I'm 50. I'll be 50 this year. I have no brothers. My father passed away in 2009, and we'll talk, I think, about when I came to Arizona to join him in practice. But it's a small family. Most of our family still is in Syria. My mom's, all of her brothers and sisters, and all of my cousins. So other than my immediate family, our family is all still in Syria.
Have you visited them recently or at all?
In Syria?
Yeah.
No, I've never been to Syria. I couldn't go. My parents were political refugees and were in sort of limbo in Ohio for a few months until actually a member of Congress. My dad was doing his internship at Canton, Ohio, at Altman Hospital, and had waited to become legal and got authorization for political asylum. And had escaped the Ba'ath Party, which is a fascist nationalist socialist party in Syria, took over in 1963. And ultimately they had some infighting, and the Assad family took over that party in 1970, and Hafez took over, which is the father of Bashar Assad now. But that party apparatus, which is built on a platform similar to the Nazi Party, if you will, was similar to Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, and was just a devastation to Syria because it was an oppressive fascist party that nationalized all the companies and destroyed any economy, and has since been probably one of the most oppressive regimes in the Middle East.
So let's go back then to your parents and specifically your grandfather, and I just see a lot of parallels in your grandfather's life, his story, his mission, and a lot of what you're doing. Take us back a little bit. Tell us about your grandfather and what his role was when he lived in Syria.
You know, even though my grandfather, Zudi Jasser, passed away when I was 9, my mom always says that somehow I got his, not only his mannerisms and genes, but sort of my affinity to political change and social change and cultural change, and sort of that love for trying to find harmony between our faith and democracy. He was a businessman in Aleppo, Syria, was also a politician, had started one of the first newspapers in Aleppo after the French pulled out. Syria was a French colony until 1947, and then it became independent, and many of the business leaders then tried to rise to create this democracy with a parliament. And the democracy succeeded for a few years, but ultimately, and this is one of the reasons I served in the U.S. military, is ultimately because the Syrian military was so corrupt, and most of the average and intellectuals in Syria had just left the military to be run by the thugs of society because it was a colonial government. They just sort of left it alone, and there were 20 different coups in Syria between 1952 and 1963 when the Ba'ath finally solidified power as the most oppressive regime of those 20 coups. But between 47 and 52, there were attempts at democracy with parliamentary government, and my grandfather was very close to one of the presidents, who was Hashim al-Attasi. My grandfather had a newspaper called, he was part of the People's Party, and the newspaper he had there ultimately became Al Hayat newspaper, which went to Beirut. But he was always wrote in a pseudonym and tried to write about freedom and democracy, and initially didn't have problems. But then when the Ba'ath took over and there were these coups, they would put him in prison, let him out. But because he was so well known, they never killed him. But he spent a lot of those last 10 years in Syria in and out of prison because of the things he wrote about freedom and liberty. And my father, who was in medical school, ultimately had to escape once he graduated because everybody had to serve in the Ba'ath Party's military. And there was no more corrupt entity in Syria than the military, as we see now with what they're doing.
So your father studied medicine for some time in London.
Mm-hmm.
What was his initial interest in medicine?
Well, you know, it's fascinating. I think one of the reasons I ended up going into medicine was because my dad never insisted that I do it. You know, he just sort of let me do what I wanted and realized that.
Are you carrying that on with your kids?
I am, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My kids are still in 9th grade and 7th grade and 3rd grade at basis, and we don't, we just always ask them what are they interested in and try to push them to do whatever they love to do and what they have passions for. And my father ultimately, as much as his father was a politician and a businessman, he was the first physician in his family. Even though his mother was a professor, had been one of the first women to go and get her PhD in literature and mathematics from Sorbonne, came back to teach in Syria. There was a lot of liberal education, classical education, but he was the first physician in his family, and he just loved the relationship between doctor and patient, and felt that it was his calling, and that rubbed off on me, and was one of the reasons I came back to want to practice with him here in Phoenix when he moved from Wisconsin to Arizona in 1993.
I'm just curious, what's it like to have never been to your homeland?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because one of the things in my work now at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy is that I without any doubt, my homeland is America. But my ancestry, my motherland, if you will, of where I came from, is my identity of who I am is Arabic, is Syrian. And as much as my parents abandoned their Syrian nationalism the moment they landed in America, there was no looking back. They became American patriots within the moments in which they were signed to be able to be political refugees here and had asylum. They never wanted anything to do with Syrian nationalism because they felt that it was a failure. It was a human rights disaster. The people were not able to defeat their government. And in many ways, my grandfather had said, he used the old, I think it's Mencken quote that says that every people deserve the government they have. And he said, if these people are not going to fight in revolutions for their government, they deserve what they have. And he just left. And my father came here before him, and then he joined my father in Wisconsin. But I still, I wouldn't be Muslim, I wouldn't be an Arab American, I wouldn't be who I am if it wasn't for the Syrian culture, the Syrian history. Damascus is the oldest city on the planet, and has an unbelievably rich history, and we're seeing a lot of that. We saw the ruins of Palmyra destroyed in the recent war. There's been so much destroyed, and I will tell you that as much as now we see the human rights disaster, my grandfather had always said that the Syrian population was dead. They had died. Even though their buildings were being built and the highways were looked beautiful and whatever, some Syrians would say, oh, we've lost all of this peace and stability. I think he would tell you, if he was alive today, as my father would, if he was alive, would tell you that for the first time in the last 100 years, they're alive. They're trying to fight for their freedom. Nobody's paying attention. The world is letting them die in a genocide, but they're alive. And I hope at some time, and I tell my kids this almost every week, that we can eventually go back. And I've always said the only way we'll ever be able to go back and visit Syria is if there's a change in government towards a democracy. And hopefully someday that'll happen when I'm alive.
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little bit through the grade school years, growing up in Wisconsin. You were obviously very young. You were born in Ohio, lived very briefly, it sounds like, in New Orleans.
Right.
And so most of your upbringing was in middle America, right in the heartland. Tell me about Zuhdi growing up and what those initial sparks were, and maybe it was just the example of your dad that made you think, I think I want to go to college and then get a medical degree.
Sort of the Zuhdi that grew up in small-town America was a avid tennis player. I loved rock music. I was a Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Phil Collins fan. Those are my probably three favorite musicians growing up. Used to try to tape music, timing it while listening on the radio, and hit the cassette recorder, trying to
We are almost
it.
The same age, and I'm thinking about those moments where I was just waiting for that commercial break to end, and could I get it?
Exactly.
Could I get it taped? Because we couldn't buy the songs by the single song.
I know, exactly. And call in and request songs, and but also took karate. I was a black belt in Taekwondo when I was in high school. So I enjoyed athletics, was very active academically, was in chess club and was the editor of my high school newspaper. And ultimately in high school I was quickly trying to decide what I wanted to do, and quickly because I've always sort of been this very OCD type A personality, if you will, that wanted to – I sort of have been raised as someone who believes that part of my faith is a belief that God gives us certain gifts, and He will judge us at the day of judgment based on how well we utilize those gifts, be they physical, mental, material, whatever they are. you'll be judged on whether you maximize their use. So I, at the time, looked at various professions. As much as I loved law, we had gotten to finals in national mock trial for the high schools across the country, and people thought I was going to go into law. But then I spent some time with lawyers, and as much as I loved law, it seemed like 90% or so of your clients were angry at somebody. And while physicians, and this is why I went into primary care, most of our patients love us, love what we do, and not that lawyers aren't. Every one of us needs a lawyer, and
Sure.
we need somebody to protect us, but it's a very antagonistic profession, if you will. That's what it's based on, and certainly they protect our rights, and I wouldn't, in any way disparage being an attorney, but I thought about going into journalism as my grandfather had, but I figured that there was no profession that sort of brought together my empathy for humanity, my intellectual rigor in studies, and sort of maximized what I felt I was good at, which was communication and sciences more than medicine. So I decided to go into what's called the Target MD program. I was accepted to the Medical College of Wisconsin out of high school, so I didn't have to take the MCATs. I didn't have to get a bachelor's degree. I did anyway at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, but I didn't have to worry about applying to medical school, and it allowed me to study existentialism in college and go to the honors liberal arts school there and do a lot of things that now I'm actually using.
You're using.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Which I wouldn't have done had I not had to worry about getting into medical school.
I'd like to back up one step and ask you a question. We had a guest on a couple months ago, Chun Chun, and her family escaped Saigon 2 weeks before the fall. Her father was working for the CIA, unbeknownst to the kids.
Yeah.
And when she emigrated and ended up in Arizona, education was not optional. It was top priority, number 1, number 2, and number 3. Your academic rigor, even in high school, did that come from your parents? Was that internal? Was that something where we're immigrants and this is what we're going to get? Because I'm just curious if there was a difference because your father and mother were both educated professionals. And where did that academic rigor come from?
It came from both sides of my family. I talked about my grandfather, my dad's father, Zudi Jasser, who was not only a politician and businessman, but a writer and all of that. Well, my mom's father was a Sharia court judge, a family court judge in the Supreme Court in Damascus. He had 7 children, and all of his kids have graduate degrees. And as much as he was a conservative Sharia court judge, out of his 3 daughters, 2 of them decided not to wear the hijab. They're not necessarily they were given the choice to do that, contrary to what we see with a lot of Islamists, if you will, and told them that the most important thing for the independence of women is having an education and being able to care for yourself and not be dependent upon another man or any human being, and that independence is so important. I think was instilled in me as being the thing that makes you the most independent is your academia and is your academics and being able to have the studies and the degrees to take care of yourself and be part of the job market, if you will. Yeah. But I do think that the other issue is competitiveness. My parents were both strong advocates of the free market, and one of the reasons they came to America was the sense that America is a meritocracy. So my competitive spirit, if you will, taught me that academic rigor and success is very important. You might be able to succeed without degrees, and there's a lot of examples of people out there that have succeeded in the free market without necessarily graduate degrees and even vice versa. But still, at the end of the day, knowledge is power. And people say, well, how can you now? You're a doctor. What are you doing talking about Sharia? What are you doing talking about foreign policy and all that? And I will tell you, I mean, if you look at from the time of Maimonides, who was a Jewish physician and also a rabbi, all the way to people like Charles Krauthammer, who's a physician that is on Fox News and is one of the, I think, clearest minds in foreign policy and domestic issues today. I think there are a lot of folks that might be trained in one profession like a physician, but yet because of our academic rigor will address everything in our lives in a very compulsive, competitive way that I think puts us at sometimes better expertise than some of the folks that's all they focus on is terrorism or one issue.
So one of the things that came out in the book you wrote, which is Battle for the Soul of Islam, and I have in my notes here kind of the values that I sense coming out of those pages, and it's honesty, humility, knowledge, compassion, ethics, which all fit into your faith as well as your medical profession. And then in parentheses underneath that, I have the word competition, because that really also came out in your book. And how do you balance that competitive spirit with the humility and those seemingly softer values and attributes? And that's not to pick on you at all. I think we all wrestle with that.
Yeah, I think the way you balance it is I go to the gym every day, right? And I exercise, and I want to be healthy, and I feel that you physically, internally try to succeed, not to just please others, but to please yourself. So the competitive aspect is an internal struggle. Once the competitive aspect becomes an external struggle, then you're going to get, I think, into corruption, into exploiting things, and not being humble. Wow. And I think ultimately this is the problem in those who try to demean free markets and try to demean Wall Street as being this cutthroat environment, or Washington as being cutthroat. They forget, and de Tocqueville had a huge impact on me. If you read his book, Democracy in America, and one of the messages in de Tocqueville's book is that dictatorships don't need religion, but democracy needs religion. And one of the reasons that we don't need a police state is the fact that, for the most part, everyone you meet, if they're moral people, will not try to steal from you, will not try to attack you physically, right, and will not invade your space. When people are corrupt and it becomes Darwinian, then you need to start, this is why there's been such a brain drain in the Middle East. The corrupt people stayed there. The moral ones, who the government took everything they owned, had to leave. And, one of the reasons I joined the U.S. military is I was taught, and I believe now after serving, that the U.S. military is the most moral military organization in the planet. And I will tell you that I think that my competition drives me to want to be the best that I can, but that's between me and God. And then ultimately my patients will judge that. Society will judge that based on what I say and what I do publicly and my works, if you will. But I don't do that in order to defeat somebody else. It's amazing. Actually, one of the examples I get is I was critical of some of the religious schools in town, the Islamic schools. And I remember some of the sermons from the clerics saying, don't go to the public schools. They will teach your kids sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Bring them to the Islamic schools to learn Islamic values. And I would go up to the board and some of their leadership, and I'd say, why do you need to demean Arizona public schools in order to endorse your own brand? I said, it'd be like if I went and tried to get patients as a physician, and I said, don't go to Dr. X, he's horrible. Don't go to the other doctor, they're horrible. Use your own benefits to attract customers, to attract your brand. And this is the issue, is that part of, I think, modernization of our faith community and business community, everything we're doing is a trust and confidence and security that we aren't so insecure that we have to attack others. And one of the reasons I've focused in medical ethics as a physician is a lot of times you'll look at errors will happen in medicine. A lot of conflict happens because of an abandonment of security, and that physicians often will not communicate well to their patients. They will abandon them with fear and not really let them in on their own vulnerabilities. And a lot of that comes from a confidence and a sense of security. And that all sort of comes together with humility. But the moment that competition takes over who you are, I think you've lost the battle.
Yeah, and I think that applies personally. I think it applies in running a small business or an advocacy organization like you do with AIFD. So briefly, tell me why the Navy? Why did they win out?
Oh, why versus other services?
Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, you're right, because I did get I applied to all three branches. Well, there's four, but I have to tell you, it came down to two things. I would have served in any of them, but I looked at bases where you could be stationed, and I looked at operational tours. And to have my own stateroom on a ship, to the opportunities to lead a department, and the towns where I could serve, whether it's globally or domestically. The naval hospitals were at Portsmouth, Washington, and San Diego. Ships, I would have my own clean stateroom. I wouldn't have to live in a tent like you do in the Army sometimes. Yeah. And so I was more of a Navy guy.
Yeah. Due to our time constraints, we're going to speed through a few things. I'd love to know how you transitioned from being a typical Navy doctor into being one of the attending physicians for the House of Representatives. Or actually, was it for the whole Congress?
For the whole Congress.
For the whole Congress.
Yeah, so back from the early 20th century, the members of Congress were all of a sudden, within a few years, 5 or 6 of them died, and they realized that they needed to have a medical clinic. And because Bethesda Naval Hospital was nearby, they decided that the attending physician would be an admiral. The admiral has always had 2 physicians. Actually, now I think it's 3 that work for him. And the admiral who was working at the Capitol was my old chairman of medicine at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And he recruited me. I was vetted, went through clearances and a ton of interview processes, and was just beyond honored. And actually, I wish at the time I remember being selected, sitting after a number of interviews that you go through to make it through, pass the security clearance to get top secret clearance to do that. We take care of the justices and all the members of Congress, and we were 911 support, by the way, for the Hill with Capitol Police. So I had just remembered that if I had died that year, it wouldn't have mattered to me because I had achieved something that I knew my grandfather and my parents would be proud of, which was to be, as an immigrant, the son of immigrants, to be a physician that took care of the members of Congress. It's just amazing. Just after having served there for 2 years, it was like a cross-section of America from left to right. Every member of Congress had their own story, different personalities, if you will, that as their doctor, you just sort of realized I learned so much about this country in just those 2 years. And I was chief resident at Bethesda, so I had risen up academically at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and then they asked me to apply for it. It's not something you apply for. You're actually, the military asks you to apply for something like that.
Right.
So it was a proud moment. And then actually when I left, I got my Meritorious Service Medal upon my departure from that office, and I ended up leaving the Navy from that office to join my dad here in practice in Phoenix. And I got my medal pinned on me with Congressman Joe Moakley.
Sure.
And who, as much as I was a conservative, he was a liberal labor guy from Boston, and but yet because he had so many medical issues, he was always in the office and became an extremely good friend.
So you move out to Arizona, had a practice with your father, and how long did that last?
So my dad and I were in practice until 2006 when he got ill, and it was in many ways a dream come true to be able to work with my dad. But it was also stressful. There was my dad is as successful as he was, and the courage it took to come to the United States and escape Syria was just unbelievable. But yet he was an old-fashioned sort of Arabic tribal kind of guy who was tough to work for sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I'll encourage people to read your book to dig into that a little bit more, because I think that we've all got parents that we adore and at the same time or want to emulate, and then at the same time find out things that we don't want to be. And I think you tell that story very powerfully in the book.
Yeah, and our family, my mom and dad got divorced after they came to Phoenix, and that whole struggle I talk about. And I was always very close to my mom. I learned a lot from my dad, and he was in many ways my hero, but I also learned, as you said, a lot of what not to do. And I think sort of that struggle made me who I am. One of the phrases in my book was, and people I think can relate to this in any tough relationship with a parent, as tough as it is to globally take on Al-Qaeda and radical Islam, there was nothing tougher than sometimes taking on my own dad, because of the emotional struggle and being business partners and other things. And then ultimately, after he got sick, contrary to my wish is he ended up suing many of the doctors that took care of him. I testified to the truth and ultimately defended my colleagues who he was suing.
Yeah.
And that lawsuit then failed, and our relationship failed for a few years. But then when he got really ill, he came to live with us, and we were at least able to repair a lot of that in his last few months of life.
And that's a powerful lesson and legacy to leave for your own kids.
I never want to give a trajectory of what I want my kids to get from what I do, but I want them to know that I want them to always stand for what's true. And if I ever start doing things that are not to what I think God would be proud of, that they feel to be righteous or ethical, I would be proud of them to stand even against me. And that's one of the quotes on our American Islamic Forum website is a quote from the Quran that says, "Stand for justice, even if it is against your own kin."
Yeah.
And there's a reason I think God tells Muslims that. We're being challenged with that right now in many ways, and I think it starts at home with your own family.
So I'll put a link in the show notes to the AIFD website, but tell us briefly about what that is.
Yeah, so after 9/11, here in Arizona, for anyone that, for all of you that were here at that time, you'll know that there was a lot, the Arizona Republic, about Muslims, and there was a piece that said American Muslims torn between loyalty to America and loyalty to Islam. I read that piece and I said, oh my gosh, where did they get all these Muslims that they interviewed that blamed the Jews for 9/11, that blamed Israel, that blamed American policy? And I called the reporters and they said, well, we just went to the mosques and went to Muslim organizations, and I realized that we had to form a pro-American, reform-based organization that started to push back against the establishment in our community. And I think Americans now, after this election, can understand what we're talking about, fighting the establishment. I'm not talking about only domestic. I'm talking about global establishment in Islam. So the American Islamic Forum for Democracy was born in 2002. 9 families here in Arizona got together. We made a list of 17 principles. It's in my book, of things we agreed on: to support the U.S. Constitution, support the military, to believe in the equality of men and women, to reject any Islamic State concept, to reject the caliphate concept. And this is in 2002, Jason. I mean, we're long before ISIS. So people were like, what's this mission statement to protect the U.S. Constitution through the separation of mosque and state? People were like, well, why do you need what is that all about? And then all of a sudden in 2013, ISIS is formed, and people are like, oh, now I understand why the American Islamic Forum is about the separation of mosque and state, because the real threat is all these Islamic states, the Islamic Republic of Iran, of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi Sharia state, Islamic law control of their government. Islam is still in that time in history. For those of us who are honest Muslims, we get this. I think Muslims that try to do apologetics and say that Islam isn't the problem, it's a religion of peace, they are like the alcoholic that doesn't want to admit that we have a deep theological problem that we need to address. Now, it's not my Islam, and I think it's important that we realize that there are many Muslims in the laity and the intellectual community that are ready to push back, but they haven't had enough stimulus, if you will, and our organization has been one of those venues to do that. It's a platform to begin to push back against the clerics, against the imams. If you come to our website, you'll see the debates I've had against imams from Columbus, Ohio, to Florida, to Phoenix here. And I just had a debate in L.A. against the head of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. It was one of the leading organizations that was feeding the Obama administration its position on countering violent extremism. And our position is that should shift. The government should no longer do the CVE, which is countering violent extremism, which is too nebulous. It should become countering violent Islamism. Islamism is political Islam, is the belief that the faith of Islam is inextricably tied to the state identity and to the legal identity of the country. And I think that our organization has not only done that through our mission, but now we have helped form a larger movement called the Muslim Reform Movement, which AIFD actually convened in Washington. We brought in 15 leaders from Canada, from Europe, Denmark, from London, And it's all these little small organizations like ours that have been sort of fighting against the establishments in our towns. And I think Islam is in that time in history that Christianity was long before the American Revolution. And ultimately, our long-term vision is that we help, and the Arab awakening now has proven in the last 6-7 years since 2011 that the Middle East is ripe for democratization. But the problem is we're sort of settled into this foreign policy approach where we do the lesser of evils, if you will. And my book talks about the need to change that paradigm, that we need to no longer pick the lesser of evils, but help those who share our values, movements on the ground that believe in civil society, democracy, free thinking, that don't mind if you drop cartoons of the prophet, that are not only anti-violence, but anti-theocracy. The Green Revolution in Iran was an example of that. For people who think that Islam can't be reformed, what about the 10 million Egyptians that went to the street against the Muslim Brotherhood in 2013? Those are all Muslims, Arabs that agree with what I'm talking about, but haven't had the platforms and the infrastructure to do that, and that's what the American Islamic Forum has been all about.
Tell me, so you've got 3 kids, a wife, you work out every day, you've got a full patient load, and you run this organization. How do you balance your passions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think balance is a sort of a misnomer, if you will. I think we just move forward with our passions. I don't try to balance it. I just do what comes naturally, which is my passion, and it involves I put bread on the table through my practice. So that's the number one thing is taking care of my patients and taking care of my small business and as far as my work is concerned. And then I fill in the gaps with keeping up to date on everything happening globally and talking to media, giving them a voice, a different voice that I think can let Americans see that we're not all of one apologetic voice and that there are reformers who take this seriously. And I will tell you that I think the problem in our community is Muslims that make a living out of reform or out of being the voice for Muslims. I think if you look at most true reform, it comes from people that don't make their money out of the religion or out of the activism. So I think it keeps me grounded that my day job, 90% of my income comes from the medical practice, and the other is a passion about legacy, about how do we, if Muslims don't lead this, America will not make it. And that sounds extreme, but 70% of the world lives under some type of dictatorship. You take out China and you take out Russia out of that equation, 90% of the remainder is Muslim-majority countries. So the Muslim country majorities are all living under autocracy of some kind. And unless we Muslims that are living in America, might only be 3-4 million people, but unless we Muslims start to take the reins of what it means to be Muslim, what it means to be modern, 21st century, believer in universal human rights, this security issue is never going to go away, and the whack-a-mole program is going to continue. So I balance those passions. My number one priority is my family. I think that the greatest legacy we can leave is our children, and I hope my kids. I think if I have to tell you, you can't sit down with your kids and just sort of lecture them about what it means to be American. I can't sit down and say, well, this is like a test and here's what you have to learn. Islam has been stuck with this memorization problem of the Quran forever. They're not teaching, unfortunately, most of the leadership in our community is not teaching the values of Islam. It's teaching just rote memorization. That's why you have all these madrasas in Pakistan that don't know Arabic from a hole in the ground, and yet they're memorizing Arabic and inculcating radicals across the planet because they're not embodying values. So with my kids, I think my greatest legacy is that they see a father, a husband, who every day has been struggling in my own little jihad against jihad, if you will, and that is what teaches them that there is no struggle that is not ours. And I always tell them, if you have an opinion, I don't want to hear it unless you're doing something about it. And that's what's American. So many people sit and scream at the YouTube or their television or whatever it is, and they don't do anything about it. So as an ethicist, I will tell you that it doesn't make sense to complain about problems unless you're actually doing something to fix it. the Jewish community talks about tikkun olam, which is to repair the world. And I think we have the same principles in Islam. Christianity has the same principles, and I think it's very American to believe that, you drop that pebble and it can have an impact. So, yeah, it's challenging with the travel that I do. I try to limit it every month to one trip. I've testified to Congress, I think, 7-8 times. I do limit things so that first things are first, especially, God bless my wife with what she puts up with. I have to tell you also that our spouses, and my spouse especially, it's easy for me to take care of my patients, my practice, and go home and see my kids. The social pressures, and I've written a piece in the Arizona Republic a couple of years ago about how the sermon at our Scottsdale Mosque ended up being about me, and how I was one of the problems in the community. And he never mentioned my name, but it was obvious. My 12-year-old son at the time, elbows me and says, "Dad, I think he's talking about you." And he was saying how there are Muslims that are Islamophobic and bigots against our community, etc. So the social pressure to our families and those of us that call a spade and are trying to get our community through that 12-step program and get us past that first step of denial is very significant. And sometimes you can't blame my wife and others who love me and what we do for saying, "Gosh, are you sure this is working? This seems quixotic. Are you tilting at windmills?" And I don't know. I think I'll let posthumously people write about what we did, but it is a struggle, especially now with healthcare, the changes, and I'm not in a very lucrative specialty in primary care,
right?
But the economic and family and social struggles are quite significant.
Wow, some fantastic stuff in there. And if you don't mind, we'll go to a lightning round real quickly and find out what you're up to and how people can connect with you. But I'd like to start off, what is your favorite place in Arizona?
There's no doubt my wife and I, the place we love the most is Sedona. It is so romantic. It is a place, it's close to Phoenix, and you just can escape there. And there is no place, we should go there more often than we do. But it's not only the Red Rock and just the atmosphere, but it is just, there is something that grounds us as a couple that nothing like Sedona reminds us more than that.
Yeah. If you could require every high school student to take one class, what do you think that would be?
One class or two classes? One class?
You can pick two if you like.
I think the most important class that I took was persuasive essay. I took it as a junior in high school.
So writing.
I think that, and I've learned this as a physician, you could be the most competent and smartest guy or woman in the planet. If you can't communicate effectively within 10, 20 seconds, when I call another physician, when I speak on media about Islam or medical ethics or in a court expert issues on medicine, whatever it is, if you can't succinctly, directly drill down on what you're trying to say, you failed. And it doesn't matter what's in your head. So I think persuasive essay. Secondly, I have to tell you history. There's so much that we repeat year after year, and we don't learn the lessons of history. And it is not to, people cannot understand Islam unless you know what happened from the 7th century to the 13th across the Muslim majority world, unless you know what happened from the 14th when the Ottomans then took over in 15th, 16th, and destroyed any discussion of the Arabic language. So if you want to know what the world is today, if you don't understand history, you won't be able to fix the future.
Is there anything you're watching, reading, or listening to right now that either you're just thoroughly enjoying and that is your decompression time, or is something that's really inspiring you right now?
Well, believe it or not, as much as I should sort of, when I relax, sort of go into things unrelated, I end up watching Homeland on, I think it's Showtime. But this year, I'm a little disappointed. They're starting to go more towards the victimization route of the narrative of the plot, which is exactly what the Islamists probably are cheering. But I will tell you that I see that so much more message you can get across in dramas than any of the little 4-minute sound bites that I get on national television.
Yeah.
And it has been fun to watch Homeland. I know the the documentary I helped make called The Third Jihad. Howard Gordon, who's the producer for Homeland and did 24 and others, his brother is the producer for some of the documentaries I've helped with. So I love watching Homeland.
How can people connect with you? And I know you've got your own podcast, so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, my podcast is Reform This. It's on the Blaze Radio Network. And
we'll link to that in the show notes. Yeah,
it's on iTunes and SoundCloud. It comes out once a week on Saturday. We drill down for 40, 45 minutes every week on these controversial issues, from foreign policy in Turkey and Syria to this week I talked about the FBI agent that fell in love with an ISIS operative and decided to become a traitor to the United States. So a lot of interesting stuff.
Probably a future episode of Homeland.
Exactly. It sounded like something out of Homeland. It was bizarre. But, I have a newsletter that's going to roll out at takebackislam.com. I'd ask people to sign on to that. And our website is aifdemocracy.org. And probably the best way to follow me day to day is on Twitter at Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, DrZuhdiJasser, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser on Twitter.
All right. We'll get all those in the show notes. Zuhdi, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. As you can probably see from my notes page here, there's so much more I'd love to cover. One thing,
Yeah.
You had a statement in your book that you can really tell whether you're dealing with a fanatic or a fascist, depending on their sense of humor.
Yeah.
Can you just talk for 1 second about that, and then we'll close?
Oh, sure. You know, it's interesting, and the reason I put that in there is, you know, I look at so many different immigrant communities, and the comedians sometimes are able to touch on nerves that none of us can. And they're able to demand reform into those issues, doing it in a way that makes you laugh and takes away. Remember, we were just talking, you and I, about the insecurity and the inhibitions that prevent us from really addressing areas that need to be reformed. And I find, as a physician, there was one of my favorite movies was Patch Adams.
Yeah.
And Patch Adams was a movie about being a doctor where he had a patient with pancreatic cancer, and he was able to take one of the meanest personalities in that patient and change the way he approached his disease based on comedy. And Robin Williams was just an amazing. He brought out that way to therapeutically, as a doctor, not only scientifically, expertly treat the disease, but treat the patient. We don't treat diseases; we treat patients. And comedy and humor and laughter is one of the most natural human functions. I mean, I imagine animals have some things they do that's funny, but I would tell you that I think one of the most human things is laughter. And there's a reason I think God put that into human beings, is because it takes away our inhibitions and allows us to look at the core of who we are in our soul. And I will tell you that fascists, Islamists, theocrats who are trying to not let God and individuals have their personal relations, but trying to impose their religion upon me and you, they don't know how to be funny because they're inhuman. They are fascists, supremacists who want to control society. And I have yet to meet an Islamist theocrat that some of them might try to be funny, but they're just not funny. They don't have a sense of humor. And it's just something I think you should look for, that it's part of, call it classical liberalism, which I think was part of the Western society's modernization, is individual rights over the tribe. But humor, I think, touches at what makes us most innately human beings.
That is an awesome word to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. God bless.
Thanks again to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser for joining us this week. Among the many valuable points he raised, two stood out to me. First, his perspective on having a competitive nature really stood out. I love the idea that our competitive nature, when it's an internal struggle, helps propel us forward by activating that part of ourselves wanting to be the very best. What a great reminder for us to keep focused on personal improvement and not running over others on our way to becoming the best we can be. I also appreciated his words about trying to balance your passions. The idea of life balance has become cliche, and Dr. Jasser's reminder to do what comes naturally while making sure you have your priorities in order makes so much sense. We can pursue passions, But he seems to suggest that we have the innate ability to know when we ignore our highest priorities and let our passions get the best of us. A good reminder for me to continually evaluate how I spend my time and check whether it matches up with my priorities. It's also a good reminder that we need mentors and coaches to help us maintain perspective. So again, thanks for listening to Arizona Originals. Join us again next week for another episode, and until then, take care.